Emma stood in her mother's kitchen on a quiet Tuesday morning, surrounded by cardboard boxes and 40 years of memories. The funeral had been 3 days ago, and now she faced the heartbreaking task of sorting through everything her mother had left behind. Margaret had lived in this small stone cottage in the English countryside since Emma was a baby, and every corner held a story. The kitchen still carried the gentle scent of cinnamon and vanilla that Emma remembered from her childhood. It was the same smell that had welcomed her home from school every day, the same warmth that had wrapped around her during difficult times. Now the silence felt heavy without the sound of her mother humming while she cooked. Emma opened the first drawer slowly, not quite ready for what she might find. Inside were tea towels embroidered with tiny flowers, each one carefully stitched by her mother's patient hands during long winter evenings. She lifted them to her face and breathed in deeply, catching just a hint of the lavender soap Margaret always used. The next drawer revealed wooden spoons worn smooth by decades of stirring pots and mixing bowls. Emma picked up the largest one and remembered standing on a small wooden stool beside her mother, barely tall enough to reach the counter, learning to make her first batch of cookies. Margaret had guided her small hands, teaching her how to fold in chocolate chips without breaking them. In another drawer she found measuring cups that had seen countless family meals. The half-cup measure was slightly dented from the time Emma had dropped it when she was 8 years old. Her mother had never replaced it, saying that the dent gave it character and reminded her of the day Emma had tried to surprise her with breakfast in bed. As Emma continued searching through the kitchen, she felt overwhelmed by the weight of all these small but precious memories. Each item told a story of love, patience, and the quiet ways her mother had made their house a home. She wiped away tears with the back of her hand and forced herself to keep going. Behind a stack of old cookbooks with worn covers and food-stained pages, Emma discovered something that made her heart skip. It was her mother's recipe box, painted a soft blue color and decorated with tiny pink roses. Emma had seen this box countless times throughout her life, sitting on the kitchen counter like a treasure chest full of family secrets. With trembling fingers she lifted the lid. Inside were hundreds of recipe cards, each one written in her mother's careful, flowing handwriting. There were recipes for Sunday roasts and birthday cakes, holiday cookies and everyday soups. Some cards were yellowed with age, others were splattered with ingredients from years of use. Emma smiled through her tears as she read familiar titles. There was the recipe for Margaret's famous apple pie that neighbors always requested for church gatherings. There was the card for Emma's favorite chocolate cake that her mother made every year for her birthday without fail. Each recipe was like a love letter from the past. As she carefully looked through the cards, Emma noticed that some were written in different handwriting. These must be recipes from her grandmother and great-grandmother, passed down through generations of women in their family. The thought of this connection across time made her feel less alone. At the very bottom of the box, underneath all the other cards, Emma found an envelope with her name written on it in her mother's familiar script. Her hands shook as she held it, knowing this was something special that Margaret had left just for her. She opened the envelope carefully, not wanting to tear anything. Inside was a single recipe card that she had never seen before. At the top, in her mother's most beautiful handwriting, it read, "Grandmother's Heart Soup, for Emma. Cook this when you miss me most." Below the title was a list of ingredients and instructions, but they were different from the other recipes in the box. Some of the measurements seemed unusual, and there were notes in the margins that Emma didn't quite understand. But what caught her attention most was a separate note attached to the card. The note was written on Margaret's favorite stationery, the kind with tiny violets around the border. It read, "My darling Emma, this recipe has been passed down through 4 generations of women in our family. My grandmother taught it to my mother during the hard times after the war. My mother taught it to me when I was young and scared and didn't know how to take care of a family. Now I'm teaching it to you, though I pray you won't need it for many years to come. The most important thing to remember is that the secret ingredient has always been love. This soup has comforted our family through illness and sadness, through lonely nights and difficult days. When you make it, you'll feel all of us with you." Emma felt tears roll down her cheeks as she read her mother's words. Even in death, Margaret was still taking care of her, still trying to comfort her and connect her to the long line of strong women who had come before. The recipe card felt warm in her hands, as if it held all the love and wisdom of generations. She looked around the quiet kitchen and realized that this wasn't just about cleaning out her mother's house. This was about discovering the gifts Margaret had left behind, the ways love could continue even after someone was gone. That evening, as the sun set behind the rolling hills of the English countryside, Emma decided she could not wait any longer. She needed to cook her grandmother's soup tonight. The recipe card sat on the kitchen counter like a bridge between her past and present, and she felt drawn to it with a longing she could not explain. Emma gathered all the ingredients listed on the faded card. She found carrots in her mother's vegetable drawer, still fresh and orange. The celery was crisp and green, and there were onions in a wicker basket by the window. She opened a can of chicken broth from the pantry, the same brand her mother had always used. The herbs were easy to find in the small garden outside the kitchen door, where Margaret had grown rosemary, thyme, and sage for as long as Emma could remember. But then Emma came to the last item on the list and she stopped. The recipe called for a handful of hope. She stared at the words written in her mother's careful handwriting, and wondered what they could possibly mean. Was it a herb she had never heard of? Was it some kind of spice? She searched through all the kitchen cabinets but found nothing that could be called hope. Emma decided to start cooking anyway, thinking she would figure out the mysterious ingredient as she went along. She placed a large pot on the stove and began to chop the vegetables, just as she had watched her mother do thousands of times. But almost immediately things started to go wrong. The recipe was written in her mother's shorthand, filled with instructions that made no sense to Emma. Instead of clear directions like cook for 10 minutes, or add 1 teaspoon, Margaret had written things like cook until it feels right, and season with memories. Emma stared at these words, feeling more confused with each passing minute. She tried to chop the onions the way she remembered her mother doing it, but her knife skills were not as good as Margaret's. The pieces came out uneven, some too big and others too small. When she put them in the hot oil, they sizzled loudly and within minutes they began to turn brown too quickly. Emma panicked and tried to stir them, but she was too late. The onions burned, filling the kitchen with a bitter smell that was nothing like the sweet, gentle aroma she remembered from her childhood. She quickly threw them away and started over with new onions, but her confidence was already shaken. The next step called for adding the chicken broth, but the recipe did not say how much or how hot the stove should be. Emma guessed and poured in the entire can, then turned the heat up high, hoping to speed up the process. Within minutes, the broth began to bubble violently, boiling over the sides of the pot and making a mess on the stove. Emma rushed to turn down the heat and clean up the spilled broth, but now her eyes filled with tears. This time they were not tears of sadness for her mother, but tears of frustration and deep loneliness. She had never felt so helpless in a kitchen that had once been filled with warmth and the magic of her mother's cooking. "I can't do this, Mum," Emma whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice barely audible above the sound of the still bubbling pot. "I was never as good a cook as you were. I don't know how to cook with love the way you did." She turned off the stove and stood there, looking at the disaster she had created. The kitchen counter was covered with spilled broth, burned onion pieces and half-chopped vegetables. Nothing looked the way it should, and nothing smelled the way she remembered her mother's cooking smelling. Emma walked slowly to the small wooden table where she had eaten thousands of meals as a child. This was the same table where her mother had served her breakfast before school every morning, where they had shared quiet dinners when it was just the two of them, where Margaret had always made everything better with a cup of tea and a warm hug. Now the cottage felt so terribly quiet without her mother's gentle humming, without the familiar sound of Margaret bustling around the kitchen, opening drawers and cabinet doors with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. Emma had never realized how much comfort she had found in those everyday sounds until they were gone forever. She looked back at the half-prepared ingredients scattered across the counter and felt defeated. The carrots sat there only partially chopped, the celery wilted slightly from sitting out too long, and the herbs from the garden were beginning to lose their fresh smell. Maybe this whole idea had been a mistake. Maybe some things were meant to stay in the past, beautiful memories that should not be disturbed. Emma put her head in her hands and considered giving up. She could clean up the mess, put the ingredients away and order something simple for dinner. No one would ever know she had tried and failed to connect with her mother through this recipe. But then, sitting in the quiet kitchen surrounded by the smell of her failed attempt, Emma remembered something her mother used to say when Emma was young and struggling with schoolwork or friendships or any of the small disasters that seemed so big when you were a child. "The best recipes aren't about perfect measurements, love," Margaret would say, pulling Emma close for a hug. "They're about perfect intentions." Emma wiped her tears with the back of her hand and looked around the messy kitchen. Her mother's words echoed in her mind and slowly she felt something shift inside her chest. Perfect intentions. That was what mattered, not perfect cooking. She took a deep breath that seemed to fill not just her lungs but her whole spirit, and decided to start again. This time, Emma approached the recipe differently. Instead of staring at the confusing words on the card, she closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember how her mother had moved in this very kitchen. She could almost see Margaret's gentle hands, always sure and steady, never rushed or worried. Emma picked up a fresh onion and began to chop it slowly. As her knife moved through the white layers, a memory came flooding back. She was 7 years old, standing on the wooden stool that her father had made especially for her. The stool was painted yellow with small daisies, and it brought her just high enough to reach the counter safely. Her mother had stood behind her, wrapping her arms around Emma's small body, placing her larger hands over Emma's tiny ones as they held the knife together. "Always curl your fingers like a cat's paw," Margaret had said, her voice patient and warm. "The knife is not something to fear or love. It's just a tool to help us create something beautiful." Margaret had taught her how to cut onions without crying too much by breathing through her mouth instead of her nose, and how to tell when carrots were chopped just right by looking for pieces that were all roughly the same size. "We want them to cook evenly," she had explained, "so every bite of soup tastes perfect." Now, 30 years later, Emma found her hands remembering these lessons even when her mind felt confused. Her knife work was not as smooth as her mother's had been, but it was steady and careful. The onion pieces came out more evenly this time, and she felt a small spark of pride. As she moved the chopped onions to the pot, Emma heard something that made her pause. It was almost like her mother's voice, floating through the warm kitchen air like a gentle breeze. "Cook with your heart, not just your eyes," the voice seemed to whisper, and Emma knew exactly what it meant. She had been trying too hard to follow the words on the recipe card instead of trusting the knowledge that lived in her hands and heart. Her mother had never cooked by following instructions exactly. She had cooked by feel, by smell, by love, and by the wisdom that came from years of feeding her family with care. Emma began to feel something she had not expected when she started cooking that evening. As she stirred the onions gently in the pot, watching them become soft and golden, it felt like her mother was standing right beside her. Not in a frightening way, but in the most comforting way possible, guiding her movements with invisible hands that knew exactly what to do. The kitchen seemed less empty now, less quiet and sad. Instead, it felt filled with the presence of love that had lived in these walls for so many years. Emma could almost hear the echo of countless family dinners, birthday celebrations, quiet Sunday mornings, and all the ordinary moments that had made this house a home. She added the carrots and celery to the pot, then poured in the chicken broth more carefully this time. The vegetables sizzled softly, and steam rose from the pot carrying the first hints of the soup that was beginning to take shape. Emma stirred gently, and with each movement she felt more connected to the generations of women who had stirred pots in kitchens just like this one. When it came time to add the herbs, Emma did not measure them with spoons. Instead, she picked up small handfuls from the pile she had gathered from her mother's garden, crushing them between her fingers to release their oils, tasting as she went. She added rosemary for earthiness, thyme for warmth, and just a touch of sage for depth. A little more salt, a little less pepper, and always a pinch of patience, Emma could almost hear her mother saying, and she smiled as she adjusted the seasoning exactly the way Margaret had taught her. She tasted the broth with a wooden spoon, the same spoon her mother had used, and added just a bit more salt until the flavor bloomed on her tongue. As the soup continued to simmer, something magical began to happen. The kitchen started to smell like home in a way it had not since Margaret died. It smelled like Sunday afternoons when the whole family would gather around the table, like rainy days when her mother would make soup to chase away the gloom, like comfort and safety and the kind of unconditional love that only a mother can give. Emma stood at the stove, stirring slowly and breathing in the familiar aroma, and suddenly she understood something important. This was not just about following a recipe that her great-grandmother had written down years ago. This was not even just about making soup to fill her empty stomach. This was about connecting with the women who came before her, about keeping their love alive through the simple but powerful act of cooking. Every stir of the spoon was a conversation across time. Every taste and adjustment was a way of honoring the wisdom that had been passed down to her through generations of caring hands and loving hearts. As the soup simmered gently on the stove, Emma felt something beautiful happening around her. The kitchen seemed to fill with warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the burner. It was the kind of warmth that comes from love, from memories, and from the feeling that she was not alone even though the house was quiet. Emma stood by the pot, wooden spoon in hand, and she could almost see her mother's hands moving alongside hers. In her mind, Margaret was right there beside her, adding ingredients with the confidence that comes from years and years of practice, from feeding a family with love every single day for decades. She remembered how her mother's hands had never hesitated in the kitchen. Margaret always seemed to know exactly how much salt to add, exactly when the onions were soft enough, exactly how long to let something cook. Now, as Emma stirred the soup, she felt some of that same confidence flowing through her own hands. The soup smelled incredible now, filling the cottage with an aroma that brought back 1,000 memories. Emma breathed it in deeply and felt her heart swell with something she had not expected to feel so soon after her mother's death. She felt connected. She felt loved. She felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The secret, Emma whispered to the empty kitchen, remembering her mother's words from years ago, is that every dish should be made with love for the person who will eat it. As she said the words out loud, they felt true in a way that touched her soul. Suddenly, Emma understood something that had puzzled her all day. She looked at the recipe card again and saw the mysterious ingredient that had confused her earlier, a handful of hope. Now she knew exactly what her mother had meant, and it had nothing to do with something you could buy at the grocery store. The handful of hope was not about adding a physical ingredient to the soup. It was about the hope that love continues even after someone dies. It was about the hope that family traditions and the caring they represent can be passed from one generation to the next, like a precious gift that never loses its value. It was about the hope that when we cook for someone, we are doing more than just feeding their body. We are feeding their heart, their spirit, their need to feel loved and cared for. Emma realized that this hope had been in her mother's cooking all along, in every meal Margaret had ever made for her family. Emma lifted the wooden spoon to her lips and tasted the soup carefully. The moment the warm liquid touched her tongue, she gasped with surprise and joy. It tasted exactly like the soup her mother used to make when Emma was sick as a child, when she had a fever or a sore throat and needed something gentle and healing. It tasted like the soup Margaret made when Emma came home from school sad about something that had happened with her friends, when she needed comfort more than medicine. It tasted like the soup that appeared on the table during difficult times, when the family needed something that would remind them they had each other, no matter what challenges they faced. But most of all, it tasted like love. It tasted like the kind of love that wraps around you like a warm blanket, the kind that makes you feel safe and valued and cared for, no matter what is happening in the world outside. Emma smiled through her tears, but this time they were happy tears mixed with sad ones. She was crying because she missed her mother terribly, but she was also crying because she felt closer to Margaret in this moment than she had since the funeral. The soup was like a bridge between them, a way for love to travel across the space between life and death. Standing in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the smell of the soup and the feeling of her mother's presence, Emma suddenly knew what she needed to do next. She wiped her hands on a tea towel and picked up her phone from the counter. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for her daughter, Lucy, who lived in London about 2 hours away. Lucy was busy with her job and her own life, and they did not see each other as often as Emma wished they could. But tonight felt like the perfect time to change that. Emma pressed the call button and waited as the phone rang. When Lucy answered, her voice sounded tired but happy to hear from her mother. "Hi, Mum. How are you doing? I've been thinking about you all day." "Lucy, love," Emma said, her voice filled with excitement that surprised even her, "could you come over tomorrow evening? I want to cook something special for you." There was a pause, and Emma could hear Lucy checking her calendar in her mind. "Of course, Mum. Is everything all right? You sound different. Happier, somehow." Emma looked around the kitchen, at the pot of soup simmering on the stove, at her mother's recipe card on the counter, at all the signs of love that filled this little cottage. "Yes, darling," she said softly. "Everything is going to be all right. I want to teach you your great-grandmother's soup recipe. I found it today in Gran's recipe box, and I think it's time you learned how to cook with love." Lucy was quiet for a moment, and then Emma heard something beautiful in her daughter's voice. "I would love that, Mum. I'll be there tomorrow evening. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself, love. Just bring yourself." The next evening, as the sun began to set behind the rolling hills, Lucy's small blue car pulled into the gravel driveway of her grandmother's cottage. Emma watched from the kitchen window as her daughter gathered her handbag and a bunch of flowers from the passenger seat. Lucy looked tired from the long drive from London, but there was curiosity in her eyes as she walked toward the front door. Emma opened the door before Lucy could knock, and they embraced warmly. It had been nearly a month since they had seen each other, not since the funeral, and Emma realized how much she had missed her daughter's presence in the house. "The cottage smells wonderful, Mum," Lucy said as she stepped inside, breathing in the lingering scent of herbs and warmth that had filled the kitchen since Emma had cooked the soup the night before. "It smells like Gran's house always used to smell." Emma smiled and led Lucy into the kitchen, where she had laid out all the ingredients for the soup on the wooden counter. The recipe card sat beside them, along with Margaret's old blue recipe box, still open from the day before. Lucy picked up the card carefully, reading her great-grandmother's handwriting with fascination. "I've never seen this recipe before," Lucy said, running her finger along the faded ink. Gran never made this soup for me when I was little. Emma nodded and began to tell Lucy the whole story. She explained how she had found the recipe card hidden at the bottom of Margaret's recipe box, with a special envelope marked with Emma's name. She told her about the note that had been attached, about the 4 generations of women who had passed this recipe down, and about the mysterious ingredient called a handful of hope. Lucy listened with wide eyes as Emma described her first failed attempt at cooking the soup, and how she had finally understood that the recipe was about much more than just following instructions. As Emma spoke, she could see understanding growing in her daughter's face. "So this soup connected you with Gran even after she was gone?" Lucy asked softly. "Yes, love," Emma replied. "And tonight I wanted to connect you with all of us." Together, mother and daughter began to cook. Emma guided Lucy through each step, just as Margaret had guided Emma decades earlier. She showed Lucy how to chop the onions evenly, how to tell when they were soft enough by their sweet smell, and how to add the other vegetables in the right order so everything would cook perfectly. As they worked side by side, Emma taught Lucy the same lessons that Margaret had taught her. "Season by taste, not by measurement," Emma explained, handing Lucy the wooden spoon to try the broth. "Your great-grandmother always said that recipes are suggestions, but your heart knows what tastes right." Lucy tasted the soup and nodded thoughtfully. "It needs just a little more salt," she said, and Emma beamed with pride as her daughter added just a pinch, tasted again and smiled with satisfaction. "How do you know when something is ready?" Lucy asked as they watched the vegetables simmer in the golden broth. Emma breathed in deeply. "You know by the way it smells," she said. "When it smells like comfort, like home, like love, then it's ready. Your nose will tell you before your eyes ever could." As they stirred the pot together, taking turns with the wooden spoon, Emma shared more of Margaret's wisdom. "Your grandmother always said that recipes are really just love letters," she explained, watching Lucy's face carefully. "She believed that when we cook for someone, we're telling them that they matter, that they deserve care, that they're worth our time and effort." Lucy was quiet for a moment thinking about this. "So this soup isn't just food," she said slowly. "It's all the care and love that the women in our family have given to their children for generations." Emma felt her heart swell with pride and love. "Exactly, darling. You understand perfectly." When the soup was ready, they sat at the same wooden table where Emma had eaten as a child, where Margaret had served countless meals with love and patience. The kitchen was filled with the warm light of the setting sun streaming through the windows, and with the rich aroma of the soup that now carried the love of 4 generations of women. As they ate together, sharing stories and memories of Margaret, Emma felt her mother's presence one more time. It was gentle and peaceful, like a warm hand on her shoulder, and she knew that Margaret would be so happy to see this moment. The tradition was continuing. Love was being passed down through something as simple but meaningful as cooking together. Before Lucy left that night to drive back to London, Emma sat at the kitchen table and carefully wrote out the recipe on a fresh card. She included all the ingredients and instructions, but at the bottom she added her own note. "For Lucy, this is how we keep love alive, one bowl at a time. Cook this when you want to feel close to all the women who loved you before you were even born." Lucy read the note and her eyes filled with tears. She hugged her mother tightly, holding on longer than usual. "Thank you, Mum," she whispered. "Now I understand why food always tastes better when it's made with love." Emma smiled as she watched Lucy's car disappear down the country road, knowing that her mother's legacy would continue. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It lives on in the traditions we keep, the kindness we show, and the ways we take care of each other. Sometimes the most powerful love comes in the simplest forms, like a warm bowl of soup shared between generations.